My name is Eleanor Brooks, but everyone calls me Ellie. I'm 74 years old now, and when I look back at the winding road that brought me here, I see a story painted with both tears and laughter, doubt and unwavering faith. Born in the heart of Alabama in 1951, I've walked through valleys so deep I thought I'd never see sunlight again, and climbed mountains that showed me views I never imagined possible. People often ask me how I became a pastor in a time when women weren't welcomed behind pulpits, or how I survived losing my first child at just 33. They want to know the secret to a marriage that's lasted 50 years, or how I found the strength to build a community that's become home to hundreds of souls searching for belonging. The truth is, there's no simple answer. Life isn't a straight line. It's a tapestry woven with threads of joy and sorrow, triumph and failure, questions and discoveries. My journey began in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, where Sunday church was as certain as sunrise, and where dreams seemed too big for the dusty streets that held us. But sometimes the smallest seeds grow into the mightiest trees. Sometimes the most broken hearts learn to love the deepest. And sometimes the questions that shake us to our core become the very foundation of who we're meant to become. If you're listening to this story, I invite you to walk with me through these chapters of my life. Share my joys and sorrows, my doubts and discoveries, because in the end, we're all searching for the same thing: meaning, purpose, and the courage to keep going when everything falls apart. Subscribe to hear more stories like mine, because everyone has a story worth telling, and every story has the power to change a life. This is mine. I came into this world on a sweltering July morning in 1951 in a little hospital in Cullman, Alabama. Mama always said I was born crying loud enough to wake the dead, and honestly, I haven't stopped making noise since. My daddy, Thomas Brooks, worked at the local lumber mill, his hands permanently stained with sawdust, and his heart full of dreams he'd never quite reach. Mama, sweet Mary Louise, took in sewing to help make ends meet, her fingers dancing across fabric late into the night while she hummed old hymns. We lived in a shotgun house on Maple Street, where the paint peeled like sunburned skin and the front porch sagged under the weight of too many family gatherings. But that house was filled with love. Every morning started with Mama's biscuits and gravy, and every evening ended with Daddy reading from his worn Bible, his voice deep and steady like the roots of the old oak tree in our backyard. I was the middle child, squeezed between my older brother Jake and my younger sister Sarah. Jake was the golden boy, star of the high school football team, charming smile, destined for great things. Sarah was the baby, all curls and dimples, everyone's favorite. And me, I was the one asking too many questions, the one who couldn't sit still during Sunday service, the one who wanted to know why and how and what if. From the time I could walk, I followed Daddy around like a shadow. While other little girls played with dolls, I was at the lumber yard, watching him work, listening to him talk with the other men about life and faith, and the struggles of making an honest living. Those men treated me like I was one of them, never talking down to me, always answering my endless questions with patience and respect. Sunday mornings were sacred in our house. We'd dress in our finest clothes, which wasn't much, but Mama made sure we looked presentable, and walk the 6 blocks to First Baptist Church. The building was nothing fancy, just white clapboard with a simple steeple, but inside those walls, something magical happened. The music would fill every corner, voices raised in harmony, and Pastor Williams would preach with such passion that you could feel God moving in the room. I remember the first time I felt called to ministry. I was 8 years old, sitting in that wooden pew, when Pastor Williams asked if anyone felt God tugging at their heart. My little hand shot up before I could stop it. People chuckled, thinking it was cute, but something stirred in me that day that never went away. Even then, I knew I wanted to help people find hope, to be a voice of comfort in times of trouble. School came easy to me, maybe too easy. While other kids struggled with reading and arithmetic, I devoured books and asked for extra assignments. My teachers didn't know what to do with a girl who wanted to learn everything about everything. This was 1950s Alabama. After all, where girls were expected to grow up, get married, and raise babies. But Mama and Daddy never put those limits on me. They said God had given me a mind, and it would be a sin not to use it. The summers of my childhood were spent catching fireflies, swimming in the creek behind our house, and listening to Mama and her sisters tell stories on the front porch while they shelled peas. Those women were my first teachers about strength, about how to face hardship with grace, about how to love your family even when they drive you crazy. They taught me that faith isn't just about Sunday morning. It's about Monday morning when the bills are due and Tuesday afternoon when the doctor calls with bad news. As I grew older, the questions I asked got harder. Why did good people suffer? Why did some families have plenty while others barely scraped by? Why couldn't women preach if they felt called by God? These questions didn't always have easy answers, but they shaped who I was becoming. Even as a child, I knew my path wouldn't be simple or traditional. The roots planted in that red Alabama clay ran deep, giving me strength for storms I couldn't yet imagine. By the time I turned 16, I felt like a bird in a cage that was getting smaller every day. Don't get me wrong, I loved my family and my little town, but there was something stirring inside me that couldn't be satisfied with the life everyone expected me to live. While my girlfriends talked about boys and wedding dresses, I dreamed of college and seminary and standing behind a pulpit someday. High school was both a blessing and a burden. I excelled in every class, especially English and history, and my teachers started talking to my parents about college scholarships. But in our small town, sending a girl to college seemed as foreign as sending her to the moon. Most families barely had enough money to get by, let alone pay for higher education. And even if they did, what was the point? Girls got married and had babies. That was just the way things were. But God had other plans, even if I couldn't see them clearly yet. Mrs. Henderson, my English teacher, took me under her wing during my junior year. She was a widow who had moved to our town from Atlanta, bringing with her ideas that seemed radical to most folks. She saw something in me that I was just beginning to see in myself, a mind that could think critically, a heart that cared deeply, and a voice that needed to be heard. "Eleanor," she said to me one afternoon after class, "you have a gift. Don't let anyone convince you to bury it in a hope chest." She started giving me books that weren't on any school reading list. Works by female authors, stories of women who had broken barriers, biographies of people who had changed the world. Those books became my secret companions, feeding a hunger I didn't even know I had. The summer before my senior year, everything changed. Pastor Williams announced he was retiring, and the church began the search for a new minister. Week after week, candidates came to preach, and week after week, I found myself thinking, I could do this better. Not out of pride, but out of a deep knowing that this was what God had created me to do. The conviction grew stronger with each passing Sunday. When I finally worked up the courage to tell my parents about my calling to ministry, their reactions surprised me. Mama cried, not from disappointment, but from pride and fear, all mixed together. "I always knew you were special, baby girl," she said, holding my hands in her work-worn ones. "But being a female pastor, it's going to be harder than anything you can imagine." Daddy was quiet for a long time, just rocking in his chair on the front porch while the crickets sang their evening song. Finally, he spoke. "Ellie, I've watched you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper, asking questions that would make grown men think twice. If God's calling you to preach, then who am I to stand in his way? but you're going to need an education first. That conversation led to the most intense year of my life. Mrs. Henderson helped me apply for scholarships, and miracle of miracles, I received a full ride to Birmingham Southern College. The day that acceptance letter arrived, I fell to my knees in our little kitchen and wept with gratitude. It felt like God had opened a door that shouldn't have been possible to open. Senior year flew by in a blur of studying, scholarship applications, and long conversations with anyone who would listen about my dreams. Some people thought I was crazy, a girl from nowhere planning to become a preacher. Others, especially the older women in our church, quietly encouraged me. They had seen enough of life to know that God's ways aren't always our ways, and they had faith that He would make a path where there seemed to be none. Graduation day arrived with typical Alabama heat and humidity. As I walked across that stage to receive my diploma, I felt like I was walking toward my destiny. The applause from my family and friends echoed in my ears, but underneath it all, I heard something else, the quiet voice of God saying, "This is just the beginning, Ellie. Trust me for the journey ahead." That summer, as I prepared to leave for college, I spent hours walking through the woods behind our house, memorizing every tree, every creek bend, every place that had shaped me. I knew I was leaving home, but I also knew I was carrying everything important with me, the values my parents had instilled, the faith that had been planted in that little white church, and the unshakable conviction that God had a purpose for my life that was bigger than anything I could imagine. The girl who had asked too many questions was about to find a world where questions were not just welcomed, but required. Birmingham Southern College felt like stepping into another universe. The campus was beautiful, with towering trees and brick buildings that seemed to whisper of all the knowledge contained within their walls. But more than the physical beauty, it was the atmosphere of learning and questioning that took my breath away. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who didn't think my dreams were impossible. My roommate, Janet, was from Montgomery and had plans to become a teacher. We couldn't have been more different. She was quiet and methodical, while I was energetic and impulsive, but we became fast friends. Late into the night, we'd talk about our futures, our fears, and our hopes. She was the first person who didn't blink an eye when I told her I planned to become a minister. The coursework challenged me in ways I had never been challenged before. Philosophy classes made me examine my beliefs from every angle. Literature opened up worlds I had never imagined. History showed me how faith and culture had danced together and clashed throughout the centuries. And my religion classes, they set my soul on fire. Finally, I was learning not just what to believe, but why, and how to articulate the faith that had been growing in my heart since childhood. It was in my second year that I met David Brooks. He was a senior planning to attend seminary after graduation, with warm brown eyes and a smile that could light up a room. More importantly, he had a heart for ministry that matched my own. Our first conversation lasted 4 hours, covering everything from theology to social justice to our shared dream of making a difference in the world. David was different from the boys back home. He didn't seem threatened by my intelligence or my calling. Instead, he encouraged both. God doesn't make mistakes, Ellie, he told me during one of our long walks around campus. If He's calling you to preach, then the world needs what you have to offer. Those words meant more to me than any love poem ever could. Our relationship grew slowly, built on a foundation of shared faith and mutual respect. We studied together, prayed together, and dreamed together about the kind of ministry we might have someday. David never once suggested that my calling was less important than his, or that I should consider a more appropriate role for a woman. He saw me as an equal partner in God's work from the very beginning. Junior year brought new challenges and opportunities. I was selected to participate in a summer ministry program in the mountains of Tennessee, working with rural churches that couldn't afford full-time pastors. It was my first real taste of pastoral work, and I loved every minute of it. Standing behind those simple pulpits, looking into the faces of people hungry for hope and encouragement, I felt more alive than I had ever felt before. The older pastors in the program were skeptical at first. A young woman preaching the gospel was still unusual, even in progressive circles. But as the summer progressed, they began to see what God was doing through me. One elderly minister pulled me aside near the end of the program and said, "Child, you have a gift. Don't let anyone convince you to hide it under a bushel." When I returned to campus that fall, David was waiting with a ring and a proposal that took my breath away. He had received a call to pastor a small church in rural Georgia after graduation, and he wanted me to be his partner in every sense of the word. "I'm not asking you to be a traditional pastor's wife," he said, down on one knee beside the campus chapel. "I'm asking you to be my co-pastor, my equal partner in ministry. Will you marry me, Ellie, and help me serve God together?" Through tears of joy, I said yes, not just to marriage, but to a partnership that seemed designed by heaven itself. We were young, idealistic, and completely convinced that love and faith could conquer any obstacle. Looking back now, I smile at our innocence, but I'm grateful for it too. Sometimes you need that kind of naive courage to attempt the impossible. Senior year flew by in a whirlwind of wedding plans, job preparations, and final classes. I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in religion and philosophy, ready to take on the world. The day after graduation, David and I were married in that little white church where my calling had first stirred, surrounded by family and friends who had watched us grow from questioning teenagers into partners in ministry. As we drove away from Alabama toward our new life in Georgia, I looked back one last time at everything familiar and comfortable. Then I turned my eyes forward toward whatever adventures awaited us. I was 22 years old, newly married, and absolutely certain that God had great plans for our future. The road ahead was unknown, but we were traveling it together, and that made all the difference. Little did I know that the greatest test of our faith was still ahead, waiting in the shadows of what seemed like the perfect beginning. The parsonage in Millerville, Georgia, was a far cry from luxury, but to David and me, it felt like a palace. The small white house sat next to Millerville Community Church, a modest building that could hold maybe 100 people on a good Sunday. The congregation was tiny, about 30 regular members, but their hearts were enormous. They welcomed us with open arms and homemade casseroles, ready to see what these young ministers could do. From the very beginning, David and I worked as a true team. While he was officially the pastor, I preached almost as often as he did, led Bible studies, visited the sick, and counseled anyone who needed guidance. The older members of the congregation were initially surprised by this arrangement, but they quickly came to love having two ministers for the price of one. As Mrs. Patterson, our oldest member, liked to say, "God gave us a bargain when he sent y'all here." Our first years in Millerville were like a dream come true. The church began to grow slowly, but steadily. We started a food pantry for families in need, organized a youth group that actually kept teenagers interested, and launched a community garden that brought neighbors together regardless of which church they attended. Every day felt like an adventure in faith, and David and I fell more in love with each other and with our calling. We quickly discovered that rural ministry meant wearing many hats. One day I might be preaching about hope and redemption, and the next day I'd be helping to fix the church roof or counseling a teenager struggling with depression. David and I learned to be carpenters, counselors, teachers, social workers, and occasionally even mediators when church conflicts arose. It wasn't always easy, but it was never boring. 3 years into our marriage, we started trying to have children. It seemed like the natural next step. We had a stable ministry, a loving relationship, and hearts full of love to share. Month after month, we hoped and prayed, but nothing happened. The doctor assured us there was nothing wrong with either of us. Sometimes these things just took time. We tried to be patient, trusting that God's timing was perfect, even when it didn't match our own desires. Our ministry continued to flourish during this time. We organized the first ever community Thanksgiving dinner, bringing together people from all the local churches to share a meal and give thanks together. We started a literacy program for adults who had never learned to read properly, meeting in our living room twice a week. Slowly but surely, we were becoming woven into the fabric of this small community. The call came on a Tuesday morning in the spring of our 5th year in Millerville. A church in Athens, Georgia, had heard about our work and wanted to interview us for their senior pastor position. It would mean a significant increase in salary, a larger congregation, and more resources to do ministry. It was exactly the kind of opportunity young ministers dream about. After much prayer and discussion, we decided to at least meet with their search committee. The interview went beautifully. The Athens congregation was progressive for its time, fully supportive of having a husband and wife ministry team. They offered us the position that same day, with a salary that seemed enormous compared to what we had been making in Millerville. It should have been an easy decision, but as we drove home that evening, both David and I felt unsettled. That night, we walked through the quiet streets of Millerville, past the houses of people we had come to love like family. Mrs. Patterson's light was on. She was probably reading her Bible before bed, as she had done every night for 70 years. The Johnson family's house showed signs of the new baby that had arrived just weeks earlier, a baby David had dedicated and I had held while her teenage mother wept with joy and fear. Mr. Williams was sitting on his porch, as always, smoking his pipe and thinking about the wife he had lost the previous winter. "I can't leave them," I whispered to David as we stood in front of our little church. "These people aren't just our congregation, they're our family." David squeezed my hand and nodded. He felt the same way. The next morning, we called Athens and politely declined their generous offer. We belonged in Millerville, at least for now. That decision taught us something important about ministry. It's not about climbing ladders or building careers. It's about loving people where you find them and trusting God to use you wherever you are. Some of our seminary friends thought we were crazy to turn down such a good opportunity, but we never regretted it. God had planted us in Millerville for a reason, and we weren't ready to be transplanted just yet. As our 6th year began, I finally received the news we had been longing for. I was pregnant. The joy of discovering I was pregnant was unlike anything I had ever experienced. David and I celebrated quietly that first evening, just the two of us sitting on our front porch swing, his hand resting gently on my still flat stomach as we dreamed out loud about the baby who would arrive in early spring. We talked about names, about nursery colors, about whether our child would have David's dark hair or my blonde curls. Everything seemed perfect, blessed by God Himself. The congregation was thrilled when we announced the pregnancy. These people had become our family, and they embraced this pregnancy as if it were their own grandchild on the way. The women immediately began planning baby showers and offering advice, while the men started talking about building playground equipment behind the church. Mrs. Patterson even brought out her great-grandmother's cradle from the attic, insisting that our baby should sleep in the same bed that had rocked 4 generations of her family. I continued preaching and counseling throughout the pregnancy, even as my body changed and grew. Some traditional folks raised eyebrows at a pregnant woman in the pulpit, but our congregation supported me completely. If God can speak through a donkey, old Mr. Turner said with a grin, he can surely speak through a pregnant preacher. I felt strong, healthy, and more connected to God than ever before. This baby felt like the completion of everything David and I had worked toward together. As winter melted into early spring, we prepared for our child's arrival with excitement and anticipation. David had converted the small spare room into a nursery, painting it a cheerful yellow since we didn't know if we were having a boy or girl. I had sewn tiny clothes and blankets, my hands working while my mind prayed over each stitch. We attended childbirth classes in the nearest larger town, learning breathing techniques and discussing birth plans with an optimism that seems both precious and heartbreaking now. The pains started on a cold February morning when I was just 32 weeks along. At first, I tried to convince myself they were just practice contractions, the kind the doctor had warned me about. But as the day progressed, the pain became more intense and more regular. David drove me to the hospital 45 minutes away, both of us trying to stay calm while secretly terrified that something was wrong. The next hours are still a blur in my memory, fragments of medical terms I didn't understand, worried faces of doctors and nurses, and David's hand holding mine, while we both prayed harder than we had ever prayed in our lives. Our son, we learned it was a boy, arrived 8 weeks early, so small and fragile that he fit entirely in David's large hands. We named him Samuel David Brooks, and for 3 precious days, he fought to stay with us. Those 3 days were a lifetime compressed into heartbeats. I held Samuel against my chest, feeling his tiny heart racing against mine, whispering prayers and promises into his perfect little ears. David sang hymns in his beautiful bass voice, the same hymns his own father had sung to him as a child. We baptized our son in the hospital chapel, surrounded by nurses who had become angels to us, knowing that we were both welcoming him into the world and preparing to let him go. Samuel died on a Wednesday morning just as the sun was rising. I was holding him when his breathing simply stopped, when his little spirit decided it was time to go home to the God who had created him. The silence that followed was the loudest sound I have ever heard. David and I held each other and wept until we had no tears left, then wept some more. The funeral was held in our little church, the same sanctuary where we had celebrated so many joys with our congregation. The tiny white casket seemed impossibly small at the front of the church, surrounded by more flowers than our sanctuary had ever held. People came from surrounding towns, filling every pew and spilling into the aisles, all of them wanting to share our grief and show their love. David preached Samuel's funeral sermon himself, his voice breaking as he spoke about hope in the midst of sorrow and the promise that death is not the end of the story. In the weeks that followed, I struggled with everything I had ever believed about God, about prayer, about the meaning of suffering. How could a loving God allow such pain? Why had our prayers for Samuel's healing gone unanswered? What was the purpose of bringing a child into the world only to take him away after 3 days? These questions haunted my days and tormented my nights, making me wonder if I had built my entire life on a foundation of sand. David grieved differently than I did, throwing himself into his work and trying to find meaning through service to others. But I found myself unable to preach, unable to counsel others about faith and hope when my own felt so shattered. For the first time in my life, I considered leaving ministry altogether. How could I stand behind a pulpit and proclaim God's goodness when my heart was broken into a million pieces? It was Mrs. Patterson who helped me find my way back to faith, though not in the way I expected. She came to visit me one afternoon, about 6 weeks after the funeral, bringing homemade soup and her usual direct manner of speaking. "Child," she said, sitting across from me at my kitchen table, "I've buried 3 children, 2 husbands, and more friends than I can count. You want to know what I've learned? God isn't good because Our lives are easy. God is good because He walks through the valley with us, even when we can't see Him through our tears. Those words didn't heal my heart instantly, but they planted a seed that would eventually grow into a deeper, more mature faith than I had ever possessed before. The months following Samuel's death moved like thick honey, each day requiring tremendous effort just to accomplish the simplest tasks. I went through the motions of ministry, visiting the sick, attending committee meetings, even occasionally stepping into the pulpit, but my heart wasn't in it. David worried about me constantly, and I could see the toll my grief was taking on our marriage. We had always been partners in everything, but now I felt like I was drowning while he was trying desperately to throw me a life preserver I couldn't seem to grasp. Spring came to Millerville as it always did, with dogwood blossoms and the sound of children playing in yards, but the beauty felt almost mocking to my wounded spirit. How could the world continue to be beautiful when Samuel wasn't in it? How could other people's children laugh and play when mine would never take a first step or speak a first word? I found myself avoiding places where families gathered, unable to bear the sight of what I would never have. It was during this dark season that I discovered the healing power of helping others who were hurting. A young mother in our church, barely 18 and struggling with depression after her own difficult pregnancy, began stopping by the parsonage in the afternoons. At first, I think she came because she felt sorry for me, but gradually our conversations became a lifeline for both of us. Listening to her fears and struggles somehow helped me process my own, and slowly I began to understand that my pain, rather than disqualifying me from ministry, had actually deepened my ability to connect with others who were suffering. David and I started talking more honestly about our grief, about how differently we were processing the loss, and about what it meant for our future together. We began seeing a counselor in Atlanta once a month, a wise older man who helped us understand that grief isn't something you get over, but something you grow around. Samuel would always be part of our story, but his death didn't have to be the end of our story. Slowly, very slowly, I began to find my way back to the pulpit. My sermons during this period were different from before, raw, more honest about suffering, less focused on easy answers, and more on the questions that keep us up at night. To my surprise, people responded powerfully to this new depth in my preaching. After one particularly difficult sermon about wrestling with God in the darkness, an elderly man approached me with tears in his eyes. "Preacher," he said, "I've been coming to church for 60 years, and that's the first sermon that ever made me feel like it was okay to have doubts." About a year after Samuel's death, David and I made the decision to try again for children. It wasn't an easy choice. The fear of another loss was overwhelming, but we both felt that love was stronger than fear, and that our hearts still had room to grow our family. This time, we approached pregnancy differently. We celebrated each milestone quietly, told fewer people our news, and tried to hold our hopes with open hands, ready to accept whatever God had in store for us. Our second pregnancy progressed normally, though I lived in a state of constant low-level anxiety that probably wasn't healthy for either me or the baby. At 37 weeks, our daughter decided she was ready to meet the world, arriving after a long but uncomplicated labor. When the doctor placed her on my chest and I heard her strong, indignant cry, I wept with relief and gratitude. We named her Grace because that's exactly what she was, pure grace after a season of sorrow. Grace transformed our household in ways both expected and surprising. The laughter returned to our home, but it was a different kind of laughter, deeper, more precious because we knew how fragile life could be. David was a devoted father from the first moment, changing diapers and walking the floors at night with the same dedication he brought to sermon preparation. Watching him with Grace, I fell in love with him all over again. Our congregation embraced Grace as their own, just as they had embraced our grief. Mrs. Patterson declared herself an honorary grandmother, and more than once I found church members in our living room, holding Grace while I attended to other tasks. This baby wasn't just ours. She belonged to the whole community that had supported us through our darkest days. Ministry took on new dimensions with a child in our lives. Grace often slept in a portable crib in my office while I counseled parishioners or prepared sermons. She attended church board meetings in her car seat and learned to nap through choir practice. The church became her extended family, and she grew up thinking it was perfectly normal to have dozens of grandparents, aunts, and uncles who weren't related by blood but were bound together by something stronger, shared faith and mutual love. 2 years later, we were blessed again with the birth of our son Michael. This pregnancy was easier emotionally, though I never completely stopped worrying until I held him in my arms. Michael was different from Grace from the beginning. More serious, more contemplative, with David's thoughtful eyes and my stubborn streak. Our family felt complete with these 2 children who had come to us after great loss and were treasured accordingly. As I look back on that season of resurrection and new beginnings, I'm struck by how God used our deepest pain to prepare us for our greatest joys. Samuel's brief life had changed us in ways we were only beginning to understand, and his legacy lived on in how we parented Grace and Michael, how we counseled other grieving families, and how we approached ministry with greater humility and authenticity. With 2 young children and a growing congregation, life in Millerville took on a beautiful chaos that I wouldn't trade for anything. Grace and Michael became fixtures around the church, coloring in the back pews during services, playing hide-and-seek among the Sunday school rooms, and charming every adult they encountered. Our parsonage buzzed with activity from morning until night, babies crying, children laughing, phone ringing with pastoral emergencies, and a steady stream of parishioners dropping by for advice, comfort, or just a friendly chat. David and I developed a rhythm that worked for us, taking turns with nighttime feedings and Sunday morning responsibilities. When Grace was teething and keeping us up all night, David would handle the early service while I caught a few more minutes of sleep. When Michael came down with childhood illnesses that required round-the-clock care, I would step back from evening meetings while David covered for both of us. We were truly partners in every sense, supporting each other through the demanding but joyful work of raising children and shepherding a congregation. The church continued to grow during these years, requiring us to hold 2 services on Sunday mornings to accommodate everyone. We added Sunday school classes for different age groups, started a women's Bible study that met on Wednesday evenings, and launched a men's breakfast that drew fellows from all around the county. Our little sanctuary, which had seemed spacious when we first arrived, now felt cozy and warm with every pew filled. One of the most rewarding aspects of this season was watching Grace and Michael develop their own relationships with faith. Grace was naturally outgoing and asked endless questions about God, Jesus, and why people sometimes seemed sad when they came to talk to Mama and Daddy. Michael was quieter, more observant, but I often found him in his room reading his picture Bible or playing church with his stuffed animals lined up as a congregation. Both children understood from an early age that our family's life was dedicated to serving others, and they embraced that calling with the natural generosity of young hearts. The challenges of parenting while maintaining a full-time ministry taught me lessons I never could have learned in seminary. How do you comfort a grieving widow while your toddler is having a meltdown in the church nursery? How do you prepare a meaningful sermon when you've been up all night with a sick child? How do you balance the needs of your biological family with the needs of your church family? These weren't theoretical questions from a textbook. They were daily realities that required constant prayer, flexibility, and a good sense of humor. Community support made all the difference during these busy years. The women of the church took turns babysitting during emergencies, brought meals when we were overwhelmed, and offered the kind of practical help that young parents desperately need. Mrs. Patterson became Grace and Michael's unofficial grandmother, teaching them to play checkers and telling them stories about the old days. The men of the church built playground equipment behind the sanctuary and organized family camping trips that gave everyone a chance to relax and bond outside the formal church setting. During this period, I also began to find my voice as a preacher in ways I hadn't before becoming a mother. Parenting had taught me about unconditional love, about sacrifice, about the fierce protection parents feel for their children. And these experiences deepened my understanding of God's love for humanity. My sermons began to incorporate more stories about family life, more metaphors drawn from the daily experiences of raising children, and more honest acknowledgement of how difficult it could be to maintain faith in the midst of sleep deprivation and constant responsibility. One particular sermon from this period stands out in my memory. Michael had been sick with an ear infection that kept him crying most of the previous week, and I was exhausted beyond measure. Standing in the pulpit that Sunday morning, I looked out at the congregation and said, "I'm supposed to tell you about God's love today, but honestly, I'm so tired I can barely think straight." But maybe that's exactly when we need to remember that God's love isn't dependent on our ability to understand it or earn it. God loves us when we're at our best, and God loves us when we're at our worst, and God especially loves us when we're too tired to do anything but fall into His arms and trust Him to carry us. The response to that sermon was overwhelming. Parents throughout the congregation came up afterward to thank me for acknowledging the reality of their struggles, and several people mentioned that it was exactly what they needed to hear. I realized that my willingness to be vulnerable about my own challenges as a mother and minister actually made me more effective in both roles, not less. As Grace and Michael grew from toddlers into school-age children, our family dynamics evolved in beautiful ways. Grace became my little helper during church activities, naturally gravitating toward people who seemed lonely or sad. She had an intuitive ability to sense when someone needed extra attention, often taking an elderly person's hand during fellowship time or sharing her coloring books with visiting children. Michael, though quieter, showed an early interest in music and began playing simple songs on the old piano in our living room. The transition from the intense early years of parenting to this more stable season allowed David and me to expand our ministry in new directions. We started a grief support group that met monthly, drawing people from several surrounding towns who had experienced significant losses. Leading those sessions, sharing our own story of losing Samuel, and watching others find healing and hope became one of the most meaningful aspects of our work. By the time Grace turned 8 and Michael was 6, our little church in Millerville had grown into something none of us had expected when we first arrived as newlyweds. What started as a congregation of 30 had expanded to over 200 regular attenders, requiring us to hold 3 services every Sunday and consider building a larger sanctuary. The growth brought joy, but also new challenges that tested our leadership skills in ways we never anticipated. The decision to expand the church building sparked our first major congregation conflict. Some members wanted to build bigger, believing that growth was a sign of God's blessing and that we needed to accommodate more people. Others worried about losing the intimate, family feeling that had always characterized our church. The debates grew heated at times, with longtime members feeling like their voices were being drowned out by newer families, while newer families felt like they weren't truly welcomed by the established community. David and I found ourselves in the difficult position of trying to bridge these divides while also providing spiritual leadership for our growing flock. We spent countless hours in prayer, seeking wisdom about how to honor both the history of the church and its future possibilities. The process taught us valuable lessons about change, about the importance of listening to all voices, and about how growth, while generally positive, always comes with complications that require careful navigation. Eventually, we reached a compromise that satisfied most people most of the time. We would expand the sanctuary modestly, adding seating for about 50 more people, while also creating better Sunday school spaces and a larger fellowship hall. More importantly, we established small group ministries that would help maintain the intimate connections that had always been central to our church's identity, even as we grew larger. During the construction period, which lasted nearly 2 years, we held services in the fellowship hall and later in a large tent in the church parking lot. Those tent services became some of the most memorable in our church's history. There was something about worshiping under canvas, with the sound of birds singing and wind rustling the trees around us, that reminded everyone why we had come together in the first place. Children loved the informality, adults appreciated the sense of adventure, and more than one person commented that they felt closer to God outdoors than they had in years. Grace and Michael thrived during this period of growth and change. Grace, now a confident preteen, began helping with children's ministries and showed natural leadership abilities that reminded me of myself at that age. She organized games during fellowship time, helped younger children with Sunday school activities, and wasn't afraid to ask adults thoughtful questions about faith and life. Michael continued to develop his musical talents, eventually becoming good enough to play piano for some of our smaller services and youth group meetings. As our children grew older, David and I found ourselves having deeper conversations about their spiritual development. We wanted them to choose faith for themselves, not simply inherit it because they were the preacher's kids. This meant allowing them to ask difficult questions, to express doubts, and to explore what they believed without pressure to conform to our expectations or the congregation's assumptions about how pastors' children should behave. The teen years brought predictable challenges. Grace went through a phase where she questioned everything about Christianity, particularly the role of women in church leadership. She was growing up in a time when society was changing rapidly, when women were entering professions that had been closed to them before, and she couldn't understand why some churches still restricted female participation. Our dinner table conversations during this period were lively, to say the least, but I was proud that she felt safe enough to wrestle with these important questions at home. Michael's teenage rebellion was quieter, but no less real. He continued to attend church because it was expected, but I could see him going through the motions without much heart engagement. He was more interested in sports and spending time with friends than in spiritual matters, which worried David more than it worried me. I remembered my own periods of questioning and trusted that the foundation we had laid would hold, even if it looked shaky, for a while. By this time, our reputation had spread beyond Millerville, and we began receiving invitations to speak at other churches, denominational meetings, and pastoral conferences. The opportunity to share our experiences with other ministry couples was both exciting and humbling. We talked about the challenges of co-pastoral ministry, the importance of supporting each other through difficulties, and the ways that personal struggles, like losing Samuel, had actually strengthened our ability to minister to others. As I approached my 50th birthday, I found myself reflecting on the unexpected turns my life had taken. The scared young woman who had left Alabama with big dreams and bigger questions had become a confident minister, wife, and mother. The pain of losing Samuel had never completely disappeared, but it had transformed from sharp agony into a tender spot that made me more compassionate toward others facing loss. Our marriage had weathered significant storms and emerged stronger. Our children were growing into thoughtful, caring individuals who were beginning to make their own marks on the world. Most surprisingly, I had found my voice as a preacher in ways I never could have imagined in those early days. People began seeking me out specifically for counseling, particularly women dealing with grief, marital struggles, or questions about their own callings. My willingness to be honest about my own struggles and doubts seemed to give others permission to be honest about theirs, creating the kind of authentic community that I had always hoped the church could be. Now, as I sit in the same office where I've counseled hundreds of people over the past 5 decades, I'm amazed at the journey that brought me here. At 74, I'm still preaching regularly, though David and I have stepped back from some of the day-to-day administrative responsibilities of church leadership. Grace and Michael are both adults now. Grace became a social worker specializing in grief counseling, while Michael chose a career in music therapy. Neither became a traditional minister, but both are living out their faith in ways that make David and me incredibly proud. The little church in Millerville now has over 400 members and a beautiful sanctuary that somehow still manages to feel intimate and welcoming. We've weathered changes in denominational politics, cultural shifts that challenge traditional assumptions, and the normal evolution that comes with decades of growth and adaptation. Through it all, the core mission has remained the same: to love God, love each other, and serve our community with open hearts and hands. Looking back, I can see God's hand in every twist and turn of my story. The little girl who asked too many questions grew up to help others find answers to their own spiritual struggles. The young woman who faced skepticism about female ministers became a voice for equality and inclusion. The mother who lost her first child learned to comfort others facing similar losses. The wife who built a partnership of equals helped other couples navigate the challenges of ministry and marriage. If I could speak to that young Eleanor who left Alabama with such big dreams, I would tell her that the journey would be harder than she imagined, but also more beautiful. I would tell her that the questions never stop coming, but that's okay. Questions are what keep faith alive and growing. Most importantly, I would tell her that God's plans are always bigger and better than our own, even when we can't see how the pieces fit together. The red clay roots planted in my childhood gave me the strength to weather every storm and celebrate every blessing. Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting the one who does, even when the path ahead is unclear. My story is still being written one day at a time, one prayer at a time, one act of love at a time. And I wouldn't change a single chapter because all of it, the joy and the sorrow, the questions and the discoveries, the failures and the triumphs, all of it has been part of God's good plan for my life. That's the message I want to leave with you. Your story matters, your questions are welcome, and your life has purpose beyond anything you can imagine. Trust the journey, embrace the mysteries, and never stop believing that love wins in the end.